Why don't we get started? Welcome back from spring break, or a welcome back of sorts. I'd like to start with a little bit of administrative information. Certainly, DSU, as you are well aware of, has banned students from returning back to campus from spring break, and all classes are pure online as of Wednesday, the 18th of March. And this is certainly unprecedented in my lifetime, and at a very fast turnaround, all the faculty at DSU have converted their classes university-wide to an online format. And so this will certainly change over time for me if and when additional tools become available that will better allow me to facilitate my interaction with you. And so what the plan is to post screencasts or pre-record screencasts of the lectures and post them 2 days before the scheduled class meeting. And this will be posted to the YouTube channel for the class, and it will be pre-recorded. And so the expectation is that you'll watch that 2 days before the class, and then we'll have, during the regularly scheduled class meeting, 4:30 to 5:45 Tuesday, Thursday for this class, we'll have a live WebEx session. And this WebEx session will not be a repeat of recorded screencasts. It'll focus on a subset of the slides from the screencast, key slides, and we'll go over them with whiteboard type explanations. So we'll have fun experimenting with the digital pen, and also we'll answer questions that you might have about the material, the sort of things that I would do on the board in the class, as well as in office hours, and the types of questions I typically field through Slack and email and things like that. And lastly, please let me know how you're doing, privately, of course. If there are any issues you're having concerning the delivery of this class or other classes you're taking, please let me know. There are some resources that the university is able to marshal that could perhaps be of some help to you. Okay, so why don't we get started? When we last left off, what seems like a really long time ago, we talked about the backpropagation algorithm, and we set out to define these delta functions, a delta for node J in layer superscript L, as being the partial derivative of the error with respect to that weight vector with respect to the signal for node J in layer L. And so this delta function is something that we build and propagate backwards when we make the backwards pass for this backwards propagation. And so we started out with the final layer, and the final layer only had one output, so that's going to be delta subscript 1. There's only one node in the output layer. Superscript big L, because big L is the output layer, that's going to be the partial of the error associated with a particular hypothesis with respect to the signal for that one node in layer big L. So we took that expression and we actually substituted for what the error means. Well, the error is the difference between the output of the network and the ground truth class label, and we made the assumption for this example when we carried it through that the output was going to be real value. So we look at the square loss because we're concerned about the magnitude, but we're not concerned about whether this difference is positive or negative, and that's going to be our error function. So we can then substitute for what this output at the output layer node looks like, x1 superscript big L. That's nothing more than your tanh function, your nonlinearity theta, evaluated on the score associated with that one node for layer big L. So we take that fact with the fact that the derivative of the tanh function is nothing more than 1 minus the tanh function squared, evaluated on that same input. Okay. So you can make the substitution and perform this derivative directly with respect to S and come up with an expression. That result is your expression for delta 1 superscript big L. So let's turn our attention to this delta for the layer below. We're going to consider delta I, so it's the delta function for the ith node in layer L minus 1. And so by definition that we've been carrying through for our delta functions, that's the partial derivative of the error at the output with respect to the score at node I, the ith node, in layer L minus 1. And so if we were to look at this network, here we have the layer above, and then layer L minus 1 is right below, and the score would sit here. That's Si for the ith node, layer L, let me loop my L, minus 1. Now, mind you, this Si superscript L minus 1 is the score associated with the sum, weighted sum of the nodes at the layer before it, beneath it, at layer L minus 2. And so we want to compute that error. And so we have our error at the output here. That's our E of W. And we want to take the partial of that EW with respect to this SI superscript L minus 1. And when we form the chain rule and computing this derivative, this partial with respect to SI superscript L minus 1, we're going to make use of the functional relationship between all of the waypoints, if you will, along the way, adhering to the architecture of this network. And so the first thing we look at is the dependence on this step here. This is Sj superscript L, and that's the score for the jth node in the Lth layer. Now, what links these two together is the nonlinearity, the tanh function in our example. And so this is exactly the delta that we had computed before at the output layer. And then if with this expression, we're computing arbitrarily for the L minus 1th layer. So the L minus 1th layer, after we get that output, is going to be the big L minus 1, and then big L minus 2, and then big L minus 3. So we have that delta already, and we're basically taking this delta that we had already and sending it backwards through the network to compute the delta for that node in the layer below. So let's take a look at this. And so to compute this chain rule, the first step is this partial of the error at the output with respect to Sj superscript L. Now what links them is this nonlinearity of the tanh function, and that's just this delta that we had from before. So we just write that delta and send it backwards through the network in order to compute at least part of this delta I superscript L minus 1. So then the next thing we look at, we look at this Sj. We want the partial of this Sj with respect to the input xi from the layer L minus 1, so the ith input from the ith node in layer L minus 1. We want that partial of Sj superscript L with respect to this quantity. Okay, so what relates them, if you take a look at this, well, we have not only just the ith node, we have the I plus 1th node, so xi plus 1, superscript L minus 1. We also have the node before it through some weighted sum. So the first one, that's through a weighted sum, xi plus 1, L minus 1. And we also have an xi minus 1, the I minus 1th node in layer L minus 1. And so this score, Sj superscript L, is nothing more than the weighted sum of all those nodes that fan into it from layer L minus 1. So each of these terms comprise this score, Sj superscript L. But if we look at the derivative, that's with respect to xi superscript L minus 1. And only one of those terms is a weighted sum involving this xi superscript L minus 1. That's going to be that weighted sum wij superscript L, which is the weight from input, the ith input from layer L minus 1 to the jth node in layer L, right? And so because only one term involves this xi superscript L minus 1 out of this score, all the other terms are constants, and you take the derivative of a constant, it goes to 0, and the only thing we're left with is that one term. Now, certainly this xi superscript L minus 1 is to the 1 power, and you take the derivative, and that leaves this wij superscript L. So for the second term, we write this wij superscript L. And then lastly, we have this partial to complete this chain rule for this derivative to compute delta I superscript L minus 1. We have this last term, which is the input from layer L minus 1, input for node I for layer N L minus 1. We take that partial with respect to the score for that ith node, layer L minus 1. And so the linkage between those two functionally is the nonlinearity, or tanh function. And so that's going to be the derivative of the tanh function evaluated on that score for the ith node, Si superscript L minus 1 in the L minus 1th layer. And so we make use of the fact, and we write that last term, and so we make use of the fact, again, of the properties of tanh, and we also make an observation for the index of this summation. We're going to do that for each of the nodes in the Lth layer, right? So we have the delta portion, right? And this delta portion that has a subscript of j, and so that's captured underneath the summation. We have the weight vectors between the inputs to layer L and the jth node for layer L. Well, that's captured under the summation because that has a subscript j. But if we look at this last term, that does not involve j anywhere, right? So that's, for all intents and purposes, it's a constant. So we can bring that out of the summation, and when we perform that derivative, well, the derivative of tanh is nothing more than tanh squared evaluated on that parameter. So we have this leading term here outside of the summation, which is 1 minus theta squared of Si superscript L minus 1. Okay, so we have our summation, and then we rearrange terms here. We have our weight vector, Wij superscript L. So that's the weight vector that connects, or the weight that, or along the edge, that connects the ith node in the L minus 1th layer, which is the input to the jth node, the ith input to the jth node in layer L. So we have that weight vector, and then we have that delta j superscript L from before, and we sum them together for each one of those j nodes that we index over in layer L. Okay, and so what does this mean? It means that when we're calculating delta I superscript L minus 1, we need some pieces of information. Well, we need all the weight vectors from those nodes in the Lth layer, right? We can get those weight vectors sent back. We also need the delta j superscript L for each one of these, so those are sent also, all of these delta j superscript L's. And the good news is, well, we have the weight vector at the beginning of the forward pass. We have the tanh function evaluations on the scores as a result of the forward pass. So we have those pieces of information. And the only thing we need from back propagation is this delta j superscript L from the nodes in the layer above sent to the nodes in the layer below in order to compute these delta I superscript L terms. Okay, so the SIs affect all nodes j in each layer, and we're going to sum over each one of the nodes, these nodes in the Lth layer. Okay, so let's take a look at the algorithm. So we start out, we initialize our weights at random, and there's a lot of literature, as we discussed before where we last left off, as to how you set these weights. And then we proceed in a series of rounds in step 2 here. And we start out, we're going to pick some number n, and we're going to pick some size for the number of passes we're going to have in our batch. And for this, we're going to compute a forward pass. We're going to compute all of the outputs for every node. We're going to start with the input layer, layer by layer, going forward in a forward pass. And then once we get our output, we're going to have a backward pass where we compute all the deltas and we send them backwards into the network. Now, along the way, once we get our deltas, we're going to update our weight vector. And so Wij for the Lth layer is going to be the old value of Wij minus a learning rate eta times the input to that layer L node times the delta j superscript L. And so we keep doing this, and this is what we use to update our weight vector. And we iterate and iterate and iterate and iterate over these t many iterations, whatever the stopping criteria is, until we halt. Now, of course, you could iterate a fixed number of rounds, or you could choose to iterate until so-called convergence. Now, what does convergence mean? Convergence means can mean that you look at the error and you stop when the error or is no longer significant, like say 5% change. Okay, so this is where we last left off. Pen color. Okay, so let's get to the substantive material for today, and that's overfitting. So what is overfitting? We're going to use a motivating example to talk about what overfitting means. And we're going to start out and imagine that we have a quadratic target function. Now, I know in reality you can't see the target function, but I need to show you what the target function is in order to fully explain what overfitting is and give you an example that you can see what overfitting is. So you imagine the target function here in blue is a quadratic, and it also has some noise. And so you have your quadratic function, and then you sample from it 5 data points, and you're going to add noise to it. And you'll notice here some of these data points don't exactly touch the line here. So here, this data point is right on the target function. This data point is a little bit above the target function. So you sample 5 data points from the target function, and you add some noise to it. And so now, for the hypothesis set, you want to fit these 5 data points using a 4th order polynomial. Now, if you do that here, the fit function, the fitted function is here in red, and you measure the in-sample error, that is the divergence between the hypothesis, the final best hypothesis, on those in-sample points, the divergence between it and the target function. Well, that's going to be the difference between where this target function takes on a value for a particular x input, the difference between the hypothesis, the final best hypothesis, and this target function. But you can see here that there is no difference between this red fitted function, this 4th order polynomial, and those points sampled, those x's. There's no difference between the final best hypothesis and the ground truth target function. And so therefore, in-sample error En is 0. But if you look out of sample, well, those are all of the places for those values of x that are assigned by the target function. So let's say we look over here, right, for this value of x. If we project up, if we project up from, say, this point, this value of x, to our target function, well, we get this value assigned by the target function. But if we look at that same point x from the perspective of our final best hypothesis, we get a value that's very far off, right? So in general, our out of sample error for this final best hypothesis, this 4th order polynomial, is going to be very, very large. And so this idea of overfitting corresponds to this notion of kind of overdoing it, right? Here we had our 4th order polynomial, and it can very easily bend and twist and move. It has a lot of parameters, or so-called degrees of freedom, that it can use to twist and turn and bend to try to match what the output value is y associated with each one of these data points to match the descriptiveness of these in-sample points by the target function. But the problem is that out of sample, it does horribly wrong. And this deals with the fact that we have noise, but also our target function, we kind of had a little bit of overkill in making our hypothesis set too descriptive. And so we're going to carry forward this idea of a hypothesis set being too descriptive and use that to motivate this idea of overfitting. And so overfitting is not the same as bad generalization, right? Generalization means that En and E out diverge from one another. Overfitting is a little bit different. So suppose you have a neural network, and we'll motivate it through another example. You have a neural network, and you're trying to fit with this neural network some noisy data. Now, if we look at this curve here, this learning curve, along the horizontal axis, we have epochs. So we feed a bunch of data points through the forward pass and then do the backwards pass, and we do that some number of rounds for some batch of data. And so we set aside some amount of that data, and we're going to use that set aside as a kind of test to measure out-of-sample error. And it makes sense because you have set that data aside, the learner has not yet seen those examples, and so it's a good estimate to stand in place for what out-of-sample performance could be. But nonetheless, you take the training data that is not set aside and you run it in batch mode, and at each epoch, you measure the in-sample error, that's the green curve, E in here, and you also measure the out-of-sample error, that's the red curve, E out. So you keep going epoch after epoch after epoch, and you can see here that, wow, while E in and E out, they kind of track with one another, and over time, in-sample error starts to decrease and decrease and decrease. Now, E out, because it tracks with E in, it too does decrease. Now, certainly there's a little bit of divergence over time, but there's going to be a point at which E in is going to continue to decrease. That's at this point here. E in continues to decrease, but then E out starts to increase, right? That's the point where overfitting is beginning to occur. And the reason for that is that your model has a lot of parameters. It's very complex. It's starting to fit the noise in the in-sample data. Now, of course, if you have a very large number of points, an infinite number of points, well, you're not going to be fitting noise because you have a perfect example for every possible data point what your target function would assign as a label. But that's not the case here. You have a finite data set, so you only have a very small view into how the target function would label certain feature values. And so overfitting is that point where E in continues to decrease, your in-sample error, but E out starts to diverge. Now, certainly, if you could only detect where this point is and stop your training, so-called early stopping, you could get very good generalization because you're stopping at that point just when or just before when overfitting is starting to occur. But the problem is you don't know what this early stopping point is. And we're going to talk about what that overfitting is and also maybe motivate what types of things you can do in order to get to this idea of stopping before you get overfitting, to put a control, if you will, on overfitting. Okay, and so the culprit is noise. And the whole reason for overfitting is because your hypothesis set is so complex, it can twist and turn and bend in so many different ways, is that you're fitting the data more than is necessary. Because all you care about is generalization, but you don't care so much about the noise in that data. And if that data has a lot of noise, you're going to fit the pattern in that noise and not particularly the general trend that you want to represent or depict out of sample. And so what happens in overfitting is that you treat noise as if it were a viable pattern, right? Rather than just ignoring it. So let's take a look at some snow or a test pattern, randomized pattern of things that used to come on a tube TV. Now, of course, one of the things you could kind of convince yourself is if you look at it long enough, you can almost see maybe, this looks like an eye, and then maybe there's like the rest of a fish, right? And then you could convince yourself, well, that's the rest of the fish, and then there's like a fin here, and there's a fin there, right? You could convince yourself that there's a pattern there when there really isn't a pattern. And that's exactly what overfitting is, okay? So discerning a pattern that does not exist is a consequence of treating noise as if it were a viable pattern, right? As we had just illustrated there with that noise in a TV signal, you can convince yourself that there's a pattern there when there is no pattern, okay? And fitting noise is going to be very harmful to your out-of-sample error because noise is something that's ephemeral. It's going to be different depending on the sample data that you have been given. Okay, so here's an example. Let me pause. So here's an example. We have two target functions. The first target function, the frame here on the left, your left, is going to be a 10th order polynomial, and we're going to add noise to that 10th order polynomial. So you start out, you choose an x value, you sample that x value, and then you look at the value of the target function, that's here, and then you're going to perturb it some amount, adding some noise, causing it to get bigger or smaller than the ground truth or the target function. So we have this 10th order polynomial, and we're going to add noise to it. And we're going to take 15 examples, so we're going to sample 15 points from this noisy 10th order polynomial target function. Now, if you look here at these points, some of these points are really far away from the ground truth target function, and some of them are much closer, and you see this noise process is different with respect to each one of these X inputs associated with the target function, the labeling given by the target function. So we're also going to consider, in addition to the 10th order noisy polynomial, we're also going to consider a 50th order polynomial with no noise. And that's going to be this frame on the right, your right. And so here, you'll notice each of the points, first of all, this 50th order polynomial, because it has more degrees of freedom, you're going to see this thing is more wiggly, right? It can twist and turn and bend much more dramatically than the 10th order polynomial can. And you'll notice that each one of these 15 samples on this target function, they're exactly on the target function. There's no noise, okay? So the blue line here is the target function, and each one of these points is a data point in one dimension. So here we have an X value. If we project up that X value here, we evaluate the target function. It assigns the following label corresponding to the projection of each of these points on the Y-axis. Okay, so our goal now is to take two different hypothesis sets and try to fit these two different hypothesis sets to the 10th order noisy polynomial as well as the 50th order non-noisy polynomial. Okay, so let's take a look at this. On the left, that corresponds to the 10th order noisy polynomial, and on the right, that figure and the table corresponds to the 50th order non-noisy polynomial. And so what we're going to do to make this fit, we're going to fit both second order polynomial and a 10th order polynomial. Okay, so let's take a look at the noisy lower order target function, and that target function, to remind you, is the 10th order noisy polynomial. So if we look at in-sample error for the second order hypothesis set, so let's call that H2, let's call the other one H10. So we look at the second order hypothesis set, or set of second order polynomials. In-sample error, it's decently small. If we look at the out-of-sample error, now the out-of-sample error is the difference between that second order polynomial, the green curve here, and the ground truth target function. It does a decent job, 0.127, right? It has a relatively okay, modest out-of-sample error. Let's take a look at the fit of the 10th order polynomial hypothesis set. That's the red curve here. And again, these samples are from a 10th order noisy polynomial. So if you're fitting 10th order to 10th order, you'd think that you would get very good descriptiveness of this 10th order polynomial hypothesis set. So the red curve, if you notice here, well, it passes through just about every single point that's sampled. It misses a few, right? Remember, it is noisy, but it gets through, many or of them, right? So if we look at in-sample error, that reflects this fact. In-sample error is much smaller for the 10th order polynomial hypothesis set than for the second order polynomial hypothesis set. But if we look at this out-of-sample, wow, this out-of-sample error for the 10th order polynomial hypothesis set is pretty bad, right? That does really, really badly, right? That's a lot of out-of-sample error. And if you look here, you'll see that this final best hypothesis for the 10th order polynomial hypothesis set, the 10th order fit, is very wiggly, right? So if you look at all of the other places that are out of sample, you'll notice that it's going to be very far off, right? So that manifests itself in our very high or relatively high value for out-of-sample error. Okay, so let's direct our attention now to this noiseless hypothesis set. Is a 50th order hypothesis set with no noise. And again, we're going to fit two things. We're going to fit a second order polynomial, and that's our hypothesis set, and the other one is going to be a 10th order. So let's take a look at the second order. Well, in-sample error is 0.029 for the second order. Okay, that's our green curve. It doesn't really pierce any of these points directly, but it just tries to do the best, kind of get in the center of them to describe the general shape, if you will, along which these points reside. And if we look at out-of-sample error, it's 0.12. Well, it's not bad, right? It's in the general vicinity, albeit it can't really pierce any of these points and describe them exactly. So let's take a look at the 10th order polynomial. And again, this 10th order polynomial has a higher number of degrees of freedom and can therefore bend and twist and curve in much more sophisticated ways than the second order. And if we look at it, it pierces just about every single in-sample point here, right? So it accommodates all of them. Here we see that it tries to kind of bend to capture this other point down here, but it just quite can't do it. But nonetheless, if we look at in-sample error, it's much, much lower. It's for all intents, it's practically zero, 10 to the minus 5, which is really, really minuscule. And you'd think that, okay, well, that's a really good thing. But if you look at out-of-sample error is catastrophically high. That's absolutely huge. Now, certainly, the target function is a 50th order polynomial, and this 10th order you'd think is much closer, but it just can't keep up with the way that these data points bend and twist and turn as defined by the ground truth target function. Okay. So let's take this other example. And in this other example, we have two learning algorithms. And let's say these learning algorithms both know the target function is a 10th order polynomial with noise, right? And you're going to sample 15 data points from this 10th order polynomial with noise. You start out, the first algorithm is going to choose H2, second order polynomial hypothesis set. And the second algorithm, A2, is going to choose H10 as a hypothesis set, the 10th order polynomial function class. And so you have your noisy data from a noisy 10th order. And let's say they both know 10th order. And one of the key observations here is that A2 is going to choose a 10th order polynomial as the hypothesis set. And this 10th order polynomial, it matches exactly what the target function is, well, modulo or minus the noise. So you'd think that this 10th order polynomial would be perfect in describing or coinciding with a 10th order polynomial target function. So let's take a look at this. So we have the fit of the second order polynomial, this green curve, and we have the fit of the 10th order polynomial, this red curve, and you'll see that the 10th order polynomial, it chases these data points. It tries to bend and twist and turn to try to match the label here, the projection along the y-axis, associated with each one of these data points, these x values. Okay. So when we look at the error, the relationship between in-sample and out-of-sample for both H2 and H10, we can see a bunch of observations here. Now, the second order polynomial function class or hypothesis set has error both because of the noise in the target function, this noisy 10th order polynomial, but also because it doesn't have the degrees of freedom to be able to represent data points as described by a 10th order polynomial. So you can almost think of H2 as being weaker than a 10th order polynomial target function. So it can't keep up. It can't twist and turn and bend enough to be able to match the assignments by this 10th order noisy polynomial ground truth target function. And so if we look at this, we'll notice some observations. Here on the horizontal axis, we have the number of data points, right, n. And as you increase the number of data points, what happens? Well, E in and E out, they start to approach one another. This distance between E in and E out starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller, right? And that's the consequence of just having more data points, E in and E out, track with one another. But if we look at the expected error, this slide, it tends to be a lot higher. And it's a lot higher because the second order polynomial can't keep up with the target function. It can't match that target function. And so the E out will tend to be smaller, but E in is going to be much larger. The E in is the gray area down here, and the E out is this gray area up here. Now, of course, E in is going to be larger because this H2, this second order polynomial hypothesis set, can't quite match where the ground truth target function is placing the outputs or the labels associated with each one of these data points. But E out is relatively small because while it can't match it precisely, it kind of gets in the right vicinity. When we look at the 10th order polynomial function class, we see something else happen. Well, we'll notice the area for En. We notice the area for En is a lot smaller, and the area for E out is a lot larger. Now, remember, this is a curious thing. It might seem like it. Here, the ground truth target function is 10th order, albeit noisy, and the hypothesis set is also 10th order. So you think that it would precisely match and get good generalization error, but the issue is the noise. That extra part is the noise. And so because it's 10th order, right, it can bend and twist and turn in similar ways to the target function, and you find that in-sample error is relatively small, this gray area. And the expected error is relatively small, effectively, as you get more data points. As you get much more data points, the noise becomes less and less impactful, and you end up having E in and E out converge, get closer and closer and closer to one another, so they track with one another, and eventually your expected error is relatively small. In the beginning also, the out-of-sample error is relatively large because of that noise, right? So while you can certainly match it, that noise is confounding for this 10th order hypothesis set. So the in-sample error starts small because you can represent it well. And because of the noise out of sample, it's going to have a lot of errors because noise is not always the same on each data point. It overfits until you have more examples for the 10th order, right? Because you need many more examples to effectively pay for that noise. So how do you eliminate noise? You have the two learners. You have H10, the 10th order polynomial hypothesis set, and H2, the second order polynomial hypothesis set, and they can't really know about noise, right? So remember, the 50th order polynomial target function with no noise, it acted a lot like the 10th order polynomial with noise. And so if you want to learn a 50th order target function, let's look at the noise level and the target function complexity. Okay, so you have the second order fit, the smooth green curve, and you have the 10th order fit, this more wiggly red curve. So target function complexity. So you have your data, right? It's noisy, and you have your target function. This is your target function, and you have some output, your function, y is your output, and it's some function plus some noise, and we'll call noise epsilon. And epsilon, if you use Gaussian noise, is going to be defined by the variance. And we're going to take this polynomial, and we're going to normalize it, and we're going to decompose it into a special type of polynomial called a Legendre polynomial. And the reason for doing that is because we want to get interesting target functions such that the terms here are going to be orthogonal to one another. When you look at a traditional polynomial, they look very similar to one another. But with a Legendre polynomial, each of these terms where x is raised to different powers, they're going to be orthogonal from one another. This effectively sets the coefficients in a special way so that you have these properties. And I leave it to you to look up information. There's widely available information, Wikipedia and all sorts of other places on what the Legendre polynomial is. But at the end of the day, this Legendre polynomial gives you the same polynomial that you begin with, but it's a different selection of coefficients so that when you combine those terms together, they're orthogonal from one another for each exponent, but you combine them, you get back the same polynomial. Okay, so we can decompose our function into a bunch of orthogonal components to comprise our polynomial, and now we can define this complexity of this new version of our polynomial informed by Legendre polynomials is just the weighted sum of terms with these special coefficients alpha for each one of these x's, these monomials, or raised to some power. And so this is our new form, and in doing so, we can actually control the target function complexity if we pose the target function in this fashion by varying QF, which is the highest order term of this Legendre polynomial method. Okay, so the terms of each order are orthogonal when you use Legendre polynomials, and it gives you better representation across more interesting types of polynomials. And here, QF is going to be 10 if we have a 10th order target function, n is 15 if we sampled 15 data points, and noise is going to be distributed as a Gaussian. Okay, and it's defined by the variance, the amount of noise, or the energy in the noise. Okay, so we have a bunch of in-sample points. We have n many data points, and we can fit the data using both models, using our second order fit and using our 10th order fit. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare the out of sample errors of this second order fit to the out of sample error of this 10th order fit. And so if you have this hypothesis set H2 for the second order polynomials and this hypothesis set H10 for the 10th order polynomials for the hypothesis sets, you're going to arrive upon a final best hypothesis G2 drawn from H2 when your algorithm halts, and you're going to arrive upon a final best hypothesis G10 from the set of 10th order polynomials. And so what we're going to do is compare the out of sample error for the more complex G10 with the less complex G2. So we're going to actually define the difference between the two, E out of G10 minus E out of G2. If this quantity is positive, that means that the complex model had a larger out of sample error. If this quantity is negative, it means, or smaller, it means that the G2 had a larger out of sample error. So positive means G10 is overfitting. Negative means G10 is not overfitting. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at this graph. Now, we have two different experiments, and we generate the target function, generate the data set, and then we measure this difference between G10 and G2, the out-of-sample error difference. And we can do that by setting aside data, doing the fit, and then measuring this out-of-sample error, or you can actually compute in closed form by sampling from the number line for out-of-sample points and actually calculating it numerically. So here along the horizontal axis, we have a number of data points, n, and we vary the number of data points, but here we're going to fix the complexity of the target function to 20, right? So we have a fixed complexity target function, and what we're going to change is the noise level in that target function. So let's see what happens here. On this legend here, we have a larger value, larger positive value. That means G10 has out of sample error that's larger than G2, so it's overfitting. And we have a negative value, that means G10 is not overfitting, right? Because the out of sample error for G10 minus the out of sample error for G2 is going to be negative, right? So that means G10 is not overfitting. So if we look here and we have a small number of data points, we see that we're overfitting, right? And as we go up for the same fixed amount of data points for the fixed complexity or a polynomial target function of order of degree 20, if we increase the noise sigma, right, we're overfitting right from the beginning. But something happens once we get enough data points. So right here where we have about 90 data points, right now we're equal, right? And we go up, increase the noise level. As we increase the noise level, we go from equal performance out of sample error between G10 and G2. Once we increase the noise, well, we start to overfit, right? Out of sample error for G10, the more complex model starts to far exceed out of sample error of G2. Now, of course, certainly if you have a large number of data points, the more you increase the number of data points, you can see that the overfitting gets delayed as you increase this noise level. And so what does this mean? It says that as you increase the amount of data, well, G10 gets harder and harder and harder to overfit. Now, certainly, if you increase the noise a lot beyond even just what we're depicting here, you're going to overfit for this G10. Right? So what does that say? That says as you increase the model complexity from G2, our second order polynomial hypothesis set, to our 10th order hypothesis set, as the noise level increases, you need to increase the data set size to pay for out of sample error, good out of sample error as the noise level increases. And so this idea expressed in this graph is that as you increase noise, the more complex model tends to overfit. Okay. So let's take a look at this second example. In this second example, it's an experiment that looks at the impact of the target function complexity. So this is not the noise. It's a non-noisy, fixed amount of noise target function. And the thing that you're increasing is the complexity of the target function. So the number of degrees of freedom, how much it can twist and turn and bend as it assigns labels to these input points. So here, again, along the horizontal axis, we have the number of data points, n, and along the vertical axis, we have the target complexity, qf, which is that parameter that determines how big the degree is for the Legendre polynomial treatment of this polynomial target function. And so the noise, sigma squared, is set to a fixed amount of 0.1, so it's, relatively modest noise. And as we go up and up and up along the vertical axis, that corresponds to the target complexity increasing. So here we have degree 0, here we have degree 10, degree 50, degree 75, degree 50, degree 75, and degree 100 polynomial target function. And so as we increase the number of data points, we see something happen here, right? And so let's say you have 40 data points. If you increase the target complexity, once you get past the target complexity of 10, you'll notice it starts to overfit. That means G10 is overfitting. The E out of G10 is far greater than E out of G2. What that means is that the more complex hypothesis set is immediately overfitting. Now, it's overfitting as a result of the target complexity. There's no noise here, the target function complexity going past the value of 10. And the reason for that is, well, G10 is exactly the same degree for polynomial as the target function, and this target function is non-noisy. So you notice here that G10 is not overfitting. E out of G10 is very close, even smaller than E out of G2, because it's a non-noisy degree 10 polynomial target function. So it matches at this point exactly the complexity of the G10 final best hypothesis. But once you increase the target function complexity beyond 10, you notice that we're overfitting. This G10 is much greater out of sample error than G2. Okay. So as you increase the number of data points, we see that we delay this point where we're overfitting as the target function complexity increases. So let's say at about 80 data points, right? We get a little bit beyond the complexity of 10. At 90 data points, you'll see here, we have to go up much higher in target function complexity before we start overfitting. And so this general pattern says that given a fixed noise level, if you only have an increase in target function complexity, this target function complexity, once it exceeds the capability or the descriptiveness of the hypothesis set, then you start to get overfitting behavior, even though you have no noise or the noise has not changed. Okay? And so on the right-hand side, you fix the level of noise and vary the hypothesis set complexity, and this idea of overfitting or the behavior of overfitting behaves similarly to when you have a fixed complexity and you increase the amount of noise. Okay, and so there are two types of noise. The first one, we increase the noise in the labels, that's called stochastic noise, right? And the other type of noise, when you increase the target function complexity, it starts to overfit. That's a so-called deterministic noise. And so certainly as the number of data points goes up, we saw overfitting goes down, right? As specifically stochastic noise goes up, so too does overfitting go up. It starts to overfit more. And when deterministic noise increases, overfitting also increases. And so here we have two different sources of noise. The first one is due to randomization in the labels, and the second one is due to a deficiency in descriptiveness that the hypothesis set has. It can no longer keep up with the ground truth target function. So let's take a look more at noise. This deterministic noise is the part of your ground truth target function for which your hypothesis set cannot capture or cannot represent it. And so you can think of it as your target function f minus your final best hypothesis operate on x, and just take that difference, right? And so let's look at some characteristics of this deterministic noise. Certainly it depends on the hypothesis set H. If you go from G2, our second order polynomial hypothesis set, to the 10th order polynomial hypothesis set, it certainly changed. So this deterministic noise is dependent on your hypothesis set. It's certainly fixed for a given input x, right? And so if you have a certain hypothesis set and you run it on a particular x, it's going to be the same on that x. For stochastic noise, it does not depend on your hypothesis set, because stochastic noise is stochastic noise. That Gaussian in the model that I represented or showed, that Gaussian perturbs those target function values. It puts noise on the labels, if you will. And so it doesn't depend on H. And so it also varies for the same input x. If you give it the same x again and again and again, that resulting value is going to be different because that's noise in the label itself. And so noise is merely the failure to capture certain aspects of the target function. For stochastic noise, there's nothing to capture. It's just some added perturbation, if you will, in the target function label. But deterministic noise arises from the fact that you're limited in being able to capture it. It's out of your league. And what deterministic noise is described as this difference between the descriptiveness of your hypothesis set and the ground truth target function. Because it has fewer degrees of freedom, it can't bend and twist and turn the same way in trying to output a certain label associated with a particular input point out of sample. So what is the impact on overfitting? And so the impact on overfitting is that your hypothesis set does the best it can to fit the noise for some finite data set. Now, if you had an infinite amount of data, well, you know everywhere in your feature space how your target function would assign class labels. But the problem is that when you have finite n, or finite amount of data for your in-sample points, you only get a small peek into what your target function would assign as labels for your feature set, for your input representation, for your features in feature space. And so because of that, well, given a certain sample, if you have noise, you have no control over it. So you don't have that many examples. And the target your hypothesis set is going to do the best it can to try to match that labeling associated with something which in and of itself is not true, right? Because noisy things aren't the same all the time. So we saw in this version of this graph or this experiment that depicts deterministic noise, we saw that the noise did not start until the complexity of this Legendre polynomial target function exceeded the degree 10 polynomial for the hypothesis set. Because remember, this is G10 minus G2. And in this, we're depicting when the increased complexity hypothesis set can no longer keep up, right? Its out-of-sample error diverges wildly from the G2, which is the second order polynomial hypothesis set. Okay. So let's take a look at the impact of overfitting. And let's bring back our analysis that we talked about and when we developed bias-variance decomposition. And so with bias-variance decomposition, we looked at the difference between our final best hypothesis index on a particular data set and the ground truth target function. We took the squared error loss and we did the expectation over the data sets, the possible data sets. We did that and we arrived upon two quantities. One was called the variance, and this variance is the expectation across all data sets of the difference between each of those final best hypotheses and our average hypothesis. And this represented this big field, if you will, this cloud of different final best hypotheses, how much variation you have with respect to the centroid of that cloud. And then we talked about bias. The bias was the difference between that centroid of that cloud representing the average best hypothesis and your ground truth target function. So one is how much you can differ based on the data set selection, and the other is how far away the centroid of those differences is from the ground truth. And so let's assume that our target function is noisy, and so we're going to have our ground truth target function f of x, and we're going to add to that a noise term. Now, certainly, if you're dealing with Gaussian noise, so-called white noise, it's centered at origin, and the expectation of your noise is going to be 0. The noise is going to certainly impact the label y that you output because it's going to be this target function output plus or minus some epsilon, some delta. So we set up the same scenario, and we take the expectation now with respect to the data set and with respect to the noise epsilon. And we have the difference between our final best hypothesis and our ground truth label, and we take the squared error, and we're going to take that expectation. So in similar fashion, then we substitute what we have for y. Y is just f of x plus epsilon of x. And so since we're subtracting, we're going to have our g superscript d on x minus f of x minus epsilon x quantity squared, because we have this parenthesized expression for the squared error loss. So we're going to do what we did before in the bias variance decomposition. We're going to add 0 to this expression, and one way you can add 0 is to subtract g bar of x and add g bar of x. So again, we're just not going to change the value of this expression by performing a mathematically legal operation by adding and subtracting the same quantity, g bar of x. Okay, so we do that, and we group terms together. We group together this g script d of x minus g bar, right? And we also group together this expression. And we're going to end up with this term. So we have 3 terms here. We have this parenthesized expression. We have that parenthesized expression, g bar minus f of x. And then we have this minus epsilon of x all under the square. So we have 3 terms. We have the first term, we have the second term, and we have the third term, quantity squared, okay? So you can imagine taking this term, parenthesizing it, taking this term, parenthesizing it, and then you have that minus epsilon of x, and all of that is quantity squared. So certainly, if you're going to compute this square, what is it going to give you? Well, you're going to have the first term squared, so that's my g script d of x minus g bar quantity squared. You're going to have the second term squared, that's my g bar of x minus f of x quantity squared. And then you're going to have this third term squared. Well, you take minus epsilon, you square it, that's plus epsilon squared. And then you're going to have cross terms, right? And these cross terms, they're going to drop out if you do out the math. I'll leave it to you to do the math. And we're only going to get what remains is these terms under the expectation. Okay, so essentially what these terms turn into, right, we get an expectation with respect to data set and epsilon of the first term, of the second term, and of the third term, and these cross terms will drop out. So that first term, that's our variance, right? Here we have the difference between our final best hypothesis, right, for each data set minus that g bar, right? And so that's going to be a measure of the dispersion, if you will, of that cloud of all the different versions of final best hypothesis you can have for a given data set. Because remember, this final best hypothesis is going to change. This final best hypothesis is going to change if you change the data. Our second term is going to be our bias. Here we have the expectation with respect to x. Now, certainly here, if you look at this, here we have our x, right? But we don't have a d term, and we don't have an epsilon here. And so this is going to look like a constant of these expectations. And remember, we had an encompassing expectation outside with respect to x, right? So we have an expectation with respect to x of this expectation with respect to d and epsilon. And so here we have a d and an x, and here we have just an x. And so expectation of a constant is a constant, and so the only thing that matters is that enveloping expectation with respect to x. Here we have expectation with respect to d and x, because this does not have an epsilon term. Expectation part with respect to epsilon, this looks like a constant, and so it drops out. Okay, so here we have expectation with respect to x of this g bar of x minus f of x quantity squared. This is going to be your bias term. And lastly have this expectation with respect to x and epsilon, our noise, of this epsilon of x quantity squared. And so the first term, that's our variance, as we said before. The second term is our bias. And this bias, another way of talking about it, that's our deterministic noise. And if you think about it, here, this g bar of x, that's the centroid of this cloud of different final best hypotheses. And this is the best you can do regardless of the data set in terms of final best hypothesis. And the difference here is how far off the best you can do is from the ground truth target function. If the G bar is not very descriptive, this difference is going to be very big. If the G bar is suitably descriptive, this difference is going to be relatively small. And so this difference between your final best hypothesis and the target function is exactly the deterministic noise. So our bias is our deterministic noise. And lastly, this last expression, that's going to be our stochastic noise. That's going to be our stochastic noise. It's the amount of energy associated with a noise process that's going to change or perturb your labels, be they real valued or discrete. And so the expected value of epsilon goes to 0, and certainly the variance also goes to 0 or goes down as you get more data points. And the reason for that is as you get more data points, you have more examples of what the labeling is on the ground truth target function, and variance goes down with a larger amount of data. And so bias and noise certainly are inevitable. Let's take a look at how you would deal with this noise. And this is a motivation for what we're going to talk about next in the next 2 or 3 modules. One way of dealing with noise is validation. And so with validation, you essentially evaluate the effect of certain model choices by simulating the out-of-sample error and checking how effective this is on your choice of model. So if you're given a choice between using a second-order polynomial fit or 10th-order polynomial fit, you have your in-sample, you have your data, you set aside some of it, and then use the rest of it. The rest of it that you use, that's your in-sample data you train on, and then you test it against this data that you set aside, using it as a proxy for what the real out-of-sample error would be, and then you stop when you get decent results. And that's called validation. The other approach is called regularization. And regularization is interesting. Regularization really separates the machine learning professionals from the amateurs, if you will. And with regularization, what you're doing is you're restricting the hypothesis, right? So here's an example where you have a 4th-order polynomial fit working on noisy samples from a 2nd-order polynomial target function in blue. And so here, if you have a free fit, you're making full use of all of the degrees of freedom of that 4th-order polynomial, and certainly that will give you in-sample error that's really small, but it's also because you have a finite sample size in-sample, you're going to be fitting the noise in that data as well. So here we have this noisy data. You see there are gaps here between the data and the target function, and that's because there's noise added. And so what this 4th-order polynomial is doing is fitting the noise in the data and beyond just the data itself, right? And that happens when you have a finite number of samples. In the second example, what if we said, okay, don't make use of all the degrees of freedom. Let's restrict some of these degrees of freedom, and you end up with more smooth solutions, things that aren't as wiggly. What ends up happening is you get a so-called restrained set. And when you restrain all of the ways that your hypothesis set can bend and twist and move to try to accommodate all of these points, you get a smoother solution. We might get something like this red curve here. While it doesn't fit exactly, it sacrifices in-sample error. You can see it makes a few errors. It does that, but you can see by using this restrained, smoother solution, out-of-sample error is much, much smaller. In the free fit, you can see here, that's a large out-of-sample error. There's a large out-of-sample error here. There's a large out-of-sample error here. And if you add all that up, E out is going to be very large. But for this constrained solution, well, there's almost no out-of-sample error here. You have relatively small out-of-sample error in this region, and so your E out is going to be much, much smaller. And so we'll talk about these two ideas in the next 2 or 3 modules of validation and regularization, and we will pick up and go forward from there. So that's all I had to say, and we will end, and I will see you on Tuesday.